Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is Ian Bremmer. He is the president and founder of Eurasia Group. Ian, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Eurasia Group just released its list of the top risks for 2026, and the list came out on January 5th, but you, along with the rest of the world, woke up on January 3rd to the news that the United States forces went into Venezuela, launched an operation that resulted in the capture of the country's sitting leader, Nicolás Maduro. So to start off the conversation, how much did that incursion impact the list?
Didn't change the list. It did require us to update the news, of course. A couple of quick things. The first is back in 2012, we started talking about a G0 world where the United States was less interested in providing leadership of collective security and free trade and rule of law and promotion of democracy, and that no other country or group of countries would be able to step in. That's structural. Trump has been a symptom of that. He's been a beneficiary. He's certainly been an accelerant, but the process is the same, and that has, sort of really informed a lot of our analysis. More broadly, we knew in December with the National Security Strategy document of the United States that the Donroe Doctrine was a significant component of the prioritization for U.S. foreign policy. And as it was getting harder to focus on tariffs as a U.S. instrument of coercion internationally because of affordability, because the Chinese hit back, because of the upcoming Supreme Court rulings on IEEPA, the focus on areas that the U.S. would have more capacity to act unilaterally, the military and the security space, was clearly growing. Plus, Trump had, of course, given Maduro the ultimatum. He was already working within the White House to find ways to remove him from power. It was just a question of what the timing was going to be. So there was no surprise in the order. There was no surprise in Maduro being removed. The success of the military operation, now that certainly was beyond, I think, what people would have expected. It was at the high end of execution capacity. This risk was pretty much written on the Friday when we had the final draft, so much so that we decided to take some of that language and show people what the draft looked like on Friday, even though obviously it had to change for Monday.
The Donroe Doctrine was number 3 on the top risks, and President Trump used the Donroe Doctrine as justification for Operation Absolute Resolve, which was that operation that got Maduro out. And he said, we've superseded the Donroe Doctrine. It's now the Donroe Doctrine. Why is that a top risk? And is the Donroe Doctrine essentially just the Donroe Doctrine on steroids?
It's the Donroe Doctrine with a D in front of it. I think that's the principal thing, and it's very important for Trump that he names things. We see that with the Kennedy Center, for example. Trump, as you know, believes that he is the most consequential, important, and best president ever. And he wants to make sure that people around him say that all the time. So, having a doctrine that reflects his name personally is important to him. And of course, he did, on the one hand, it's narcissism, but on the other hand, he is a marketing genius, right? He built his billions primarily by understanding how to brand things. Putting his names on buildings that he didn't own, but nonetheless reflecting the increased value of his brand, right? So, he does apply that to American power in ways that other American presidents, frankly, have not to the same degree. And you and I may find that unseemly, but it certainly is authentic to who Trump is. Like he didn't become president and suddenly become a different person. Now, leaving that aside, the Donroe Doctrine implies that in America's backyard, as defined by Trump and his administration, the United States will prioritize its interests, particularly in the security space. It is not the limit of American ambitions. It doesn't imply isolationism or withdrawal from the Middle East or from Asia, but that in the United States and the Western Hemisphere, what the Americans say goes. Now, it's a risk in a few ways. First of all, because it's unilateral. The Americans aren't asking allies or adversaries for permission. They're not communicating with them in advance. They're making these decisions unilaterally. Secondly, the United States has vastly more military capacity to implement on that. I mean, the Russians are not asking American permission to invade Ukraine. They're just incapable. If the Russians had anywhere near America's execution capability militarily, Zelensky would be in jail or dead, right? And Ukraine would be a very different conversation. Europe would be a very different conversation. The Russians don't have the capacity. The Americans do, and that makes it a risk. But there's also the reality that for most of the countries in the Western Hemisphere, the United States is dominant militarily, but the Chinese are dominant economically. And the U.S. doesn't really have a strategy to displace the Chinese as the dominant economic power in most of the Western Hemisphere. And, you know, that matters. So, I mean, if you're telling the Brazilians, for example, well, you need to change the prison term of the former president, a friend of Trump, the so-called Trump of the tropics, Jair Bolsonaro, 27-year prison term. If you don't do that, we're going to tariff you. And the Brazilians don't change. And the Americans then back down because they realize that they actually need Brazilian coffee at a cheaper cost because Trump is underwater on the economy. And the Brazilians have more economic trade that they're doing with China than they are with the U.S. Well, what are the Americans going to send in the airborne? You know, and the answer is no. And Brazil is the largest economy in South America. So, I mean, there are limits to the Donroe Doctrine, even if they aren't security limits.
And to that point, if you're looking at how sometimes President Trump flip-flops, he was called Taco, then other times, like right now, I'm sure Maduro, you said this in an interview, you don't think Maduro right now is thinking President Trump is too much Taco leaning. Now, I mean, how does the Western Hemisphere view Trump, knowing that sometimes you got one Trump, other times you got another?
It really depends on how much leverage you have, and not just in terms of your power, but the relevance of your power vis-a-vis the United States. It's the relational aspect of that power. So, you know, Modi actually has a fair amount of leverage in his negotiations with Trump because there isn't all that much Trump can do to India, right? India is a part of the Quad. It's useful as a counterbalance to China. It doesn't trade that much with the U.S. They're growing at almost 8% a year economically. So even if tariffs go through the roof, India doesn't really have that much effect, right? It's not hurting Modi, who's a very popular, very strong leader that keeps winning local elections, right? Where if you're Mexico and you've got a weak economy that's completely reliant on the United States, if Trump tells you to jump, you say how high, and you do that on fentanyl, you do that on border security, you do that on transshipment of Chinese goods through Mexico, you do it on all of these issues. So the relevant point as we think about all of these countries around the world is where are they on the taco versus FAFO, F around and find out scale? Because, you know, Trump thought that Xi Jinping was FAFO. He thought that when he put tariffs on the Chinese would have to capitulate. He was wrong. The Chinese did not call him up. They did not immediately start to negotiate. Instead, they escalated. They punched the United States in the face, and the Americans had to back down. Maduro thought that Trump was bluffing. He thought, you know, I can make this guy do business with me. He was really wrong. And now that he's sitting in a jail cell in Brooklyn, I think he understands that this is not a taco situation. So what you need to understand around the world is where are you on the taco versus FAFO scale? And, you know, the Europeans today would like to be much more taco. They're not. And that's why Greenland is a problem for them. That's why technology and AI is a problem for them. The Americans just have much more leverage than the Europeans do. And Trump absolutely can smell weakness. He has that a predatory deal-making capability that if he thinks you don't have the cards, he's going to hit you. Ukraine is much more aligned with the West than Russia is. And yet Trump is using American power against Ukraine much more effectively than against Russia. And it's because Trump wants a ceasefire. He doesn't care how he gets it. And he understands that he has the capacity to force the Russians to capitulate much more easily than he does with Putin. So where is he using his leverage? Against Ukraine, even though the Russians have been much more challenging for America's national interest than the Ukrainians have.
Greenland has been brought up again. President Trump has renewed his interest in acquiring Greenland ever since this Venezuelan incursion. I'm curious, the rest of the world seems to be taking him very seriously on this, but one of the risks in this report is that Europe is under siege. European countries are appearing weak. What does that do for the conversation around Greenland, especially given that European leaders have said Greenland belongs to its people, it is for Denmark and Greenland, and them only to decide on matters concerning Denmark and Greenland? Does President Trump think about that? Does that really matter to him that European leaders are against that?
You know, it's true that Europe is under siege and that they're weak, but they're not equally weak on all issues. So on Russia, the Europeans in the last year have taken on all of the funding of Ukraine's ability to defend itself. And what that means is they bought themselves a seat at the table. They bought themselves leverage. They are less FAFO on Ukraine. And that's meant that, you know, they have the ability to shape what the outcomes will and will not be. I mean, for Trump to cut off the Ukrainians now means he has to stop American companies selling weapons to Europe that the Europeans are buying and sending on at a profit, right? And for U.S. taxpayers are benefiting. U.S. taxpayers aren't paying. So Trump really doesn't have the leverage directly over the Ukrainian outcomes that he did a year ago. But on Greenland, you know, the Europeans are not particularly credible. I'll tell you, earlier today, I actually got a note from a head of state from Europe. I'm not going to say which one it is because that would be out of school, but it's a really interesting point. I'm truly worried over the EU right now. We don't fail in a realistic analysis, but in execution, due to common constitutional and domestic electoral limitations. You're quite right. There are no forces available to change Europe right now. And even though the EU is the very best we've got, the lack of sufficient credibility among Europeans and among national governments makes it slightly a catch-22. So the European leaders understand that this is a problem for them because they're not a state. The U.S. is a state with checks and balances, an independent judiciary, a federal system, right? But it's a state. China is a state that has a much stronger individual leader with even fewer checks and balances. The EU has far more checks and balances. It's harder for the EU to project power, even though they have the world's largest common market, because these governments are individual. They have different interests on, let's say, Greenland. The Nordics feel very strongly, the Southern Europeans not so much, and Trump can take advantage of that. Now, the Europeans have mostly said, not all, but mostly they've said if the Americans invade Greenland, it's the end of NATO. Trump's not going to invade Greenland. He's going to use carrots and sticks, economic and diplomacy, coercive and not, covert and overt, to try to buy, convince, cajole, pressure the Greenlanders into saying they want to be a part of the United States. That, at no point is it going to be easy for the Europeans to say, aha, that's it, NATO is over. So it's tough. It's really tough for them.
When we had this conversation last year, you said that we are heading back to the law of the jungle. And I thought back to that when I'm looking at the Trump administration working with Delcy Rodriguez, who was Maduro's vice president. Now she's the interim president instead of the opposition leader, because you called this, it's not regime change, it's regime roulette. She said she wants to collaborate with the United States. The government released political prisoners. Do you think that this is an example of Venezuela seeing that, hey, we need to play the rules of the jungle here?
That's right. And at least for now, with the United States paying laser-like attention to their country, and Trump is impulsive and he moves around, and so that may not be true in a month or in 6 months, and it certainly won't be true in 2029. But for now, right, I mean, not doing what Trump and Marco Rubio and others are suggesting is potentially a death sentence for Delcy Rodriguez, and at very least, it means that she's going to be ousted from power. They know that. And so even though it is essentially the same regime as Nicolás Maduro was running just a week ago, it is a very different international environment. And when Trump says we're going to run the place and we're going to control the oil, the credibility of that statement for now is very high. And so that means for now, Delcy Rodriguez and her government should be doing, or at least pretending to do, what Trump wants them to do. Now, will there eventually be a political transition? Will they actually follow through on that? Will they drag it out? Will they say one thing and actually do another? I suspect there's going to be a lot of that. And Trump is going to have to continue to expend a lot of effort to ensure that it goes the way that his administration, broadly speaking, wants it to. But the power imbalance is very, very clear, and the law of the jungle is obvious. But there's another point I want to make, which is Trump believes that the law of the jungle benefits the United States because the United States is the most powerful country in the world. And he is right that the U.S. is the most powerful country in the world. But Trump is not the most powerful leader in the world. Xi Jinping is. And the reason for that, even though China is a smaller economy with a far less capable military, is because Xi Jinping actually has no term limits. He has monopoly control of the Communist Party and the military, and there's no independent judiciary. Not to mention there's no independent media, right? For all of those reasons, like, Trump can say and do a lot of things for 3 more years, and then he's gone. And that means that the law of the jungle ultimately is really self-defeating for the United States on the global stage. That the Americans are better off with a system of rule of law that are institutionalized, that the Americans draw up and generally are aligned with, even if not always, because the United States government is limited by checks and balances. Because in the same way that Trump undoes what Biden did with executive orders and other means, that the next president will undo a lot of what Trump does. And if not the next president, the president after that. So I think that the decision to embrace the law of the jungle is a penny-wise, pound-foolish strategy that ultimately will not benefit the American people.
I think that's a good segue to the number one risk on the list. We've been burying the lead here a bit. The number one risk is the U.S. political revolution. Why did that get the top spot?
Well, because the U.S. is the most powerful country and it has an incredibly revolutionary president. Trump is more consequential as a president, certainly than any president since FDR. And because FDR is the other most consequential president, we compared the two in the report. And, it turns out that in Trump's first year, he's done an awful lot more to break norms. He's done an awful lot more to limit the checks and balances on the executive and to politicize the administrative state. FDR tried to pack the court, expand it, he failed. He tried to purge his own Democratic Party, he failed. He did expand the power of the executive to a great degree, but he also institutionalized it so it wasn't in the control of a president. Trump is trying to do exactly the opposite, which makes him much more consequential if he is successful. And so the fact that this political revolution is underway, that Trump is driving it as a matter of priority because he feels like the U.S. political system was weaponized against him by President Biden, leading to unprecedented 2 impeachments and felony charges and convictions and a near assassination, that is a matter of urgency for Trump, and it has immense importance around the world.
I know that when you're looking at President Trump's political revolution, you're not positive it will fail, but you're more confident it will fail over succeeding. You said one thing is for certain, though, in your report, that there's no going back to what came before. So when this political revolution is over, what does our political system look like after?
Well, I think it's going to be weaker. If I'm right that Trump will fail, then that means that he will have broken a bunch of norms and institutions that the next president will not have to be constrained by. And so, you might have, instead of the United States president ordering equity shares, and having more influence in promoting crypto companies, maybe it'll be, sustainable energy companies. But those, once you break those norms, they stay broken. And that will, and the next time a revolutionary president comes along, they'll be more likely to succeed. Now, I am not fully confident Trump will fail. I do think he'll fail, and I can say why. I mean, there are three reasons in increasing order of importance. The least important reason is because I think Trump will lose the House in midterm elections. And if that happens, I think that more Republicans will see him as a lame duck and start to publicly move away from some of his positions. That's the reason I'm least confident about. I'm slightly more confident about the checks and balances that are still in place, in particular the independent judiciary, which has prevented him from sending troops to Chicago, for example, which ended the political investigations of Letitia James and Jim Comey, for example, which are likely to constrain his tariff authority on IEEPA when the Supreme Court finally rules on that kind of thing. Also a professionalized military and a federal system with the states having a lot of power, including over how elections are actually run. But the reason that I am most confident that Trump will fail in his political revolution is that he lacks discipline. He is very impulsive. He's convinced he's right. And even though he thinks the Democrats are the leading enemy, he also gets distracted all the time. So, today it's the Democrats, tomorrow it's Greenland, the next day it's Venezuela. Like, if he really wanted a political revolution to succeed, he would focus laser-like on destroying the Democratic Party. He'd focus on, investigations against the people that are funding them and their core supporters. And he would want to ensure that he's able to use the power of the military to chill the ability of people to vote in blue states. I mean, this is why some of the supporters of Trump that have been calling for a monarchy or a one-party system are disappointed with him because they think he's a broken vessel. They think he's not really committed to being a revolutionary. He's not Steve Bannon. They're right. He's not. He wants the Nobel Peace Prize. He wants to be in the headlines every day. He's not really that committed to breaking the system. And ultimately, if you want to break the system, it's harder work than Trump is willing to put in. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than smart, is what I'm trying to say. And I think the Americans are experiencing that right now.
Do you think that it's lucky for President Trump and the Republicans that Democrats aren't too popular right now either? Their approval ratings are underwater. There's no apparent leader of the left. I mean, is that their lucky break? How does that play a part here?
Oh, I mean, the Democrats are, in the tank in terms of their popularity right now. And yet, as I said, if you had midterm elections today, you'd expect with 80% likelihood the Democrats to take the House, just on the basis of the polls in all these places, and probably 70% the Republicans would hold the Senate. You don't need to have a strong leader for the Democratic Party in midterm elections, because the midterms are overwhelmingly about the incumbent. They're overwhelmingly about how the incumbent is doing. By 2028, it's a different story. And so if you're asking me what's likely in the next elections, the Democrats are going to have to coalesce around someone and a set of policies that they find compelling. Because Trump, to his credit, has been able to really consolidate the Republican Party under him. Lack of loyalty is not tolerated. Marjorie Taylor Greene, right, was like the leading fundraiser in the House for Republicans. And she was very influential in social media. She was completely loyal. She broke publicly from Trump on the Epstein files, which Trump had completely supported and then flip-flopped on, and he put a knife to her. And that's it. And, who's out there supporting MTG among Republicans in the House and Senate? Nobody, right? So he's really effective at ensuring that there is loyalty in the ranks, and the Democrats have not been that.
Obviously, when you're reading this list, there are concerns both at home and abroad, but you ended on what I thought was a really nice note. You said you're not optimistic, but you're hopeful. What exactly are you hopeful about, and what should we be keeping our eyes out on?
I'm hopeful because the system does need to change. I mean, Trump is not the cause of the political revolution. He's a symptom of lots and lots of Americans that have felt like the U.S. system has been rigged for a very long time, rigged against them, right? Rigged in favor of very powerful Americans, very wealthy Americans that aren't acting like stewards. They're not acting like accountable leaders. They're acting like they built it, and so they should benefit from it. And that is not acceptable. The anti-globalism comes from all of the wars that the Americans have fought on the backs of the poor and unconnected Americans, fighting courageously for their country and getting what in return? The free trade has benefited so many wealthy American shareholders, while we've seen, the American Rust Belt get hollowed out, American manufacturing get hollowed out, and there's a concern the same thing will happen with white-collar workers as AI develops huge productivity gains, profitability gains, but without those benefits accruing to the workers. So the system needs to change. And the fact that some of what is going to change is going to be messy and ugly and there's going to be breakage doesn't mean this doesn't matter. Ultimately, it's not Trump that is the reason for the change, it's the average American. And I think the average American has a lot of good in them. In the same way that the world system needed to change because the global South was rising, and they said no more to colonialism. Well, there's kind of a bit of neo-colonialism that's going on in the United States, and so ultimately, a lot of Americans want to throw off the shackles as they see them, and for them, the shackles is globalism. So globalism will fail and it'll be replaced by something else. I am hopeful that that something else will be more constructive and fit for purpose for all of us in the 21st century. I am not optimistic, but I know that there is such an opportunity. As long as that's true and we're here, we might as well fight for it.
And to the point that President Trump's not the cause of the revolution, he's a symptom, does that mean it continues on after he's out of office?
Clearly. I mean, Biden did not drive more political revolution. He wasn't breaking the system to a greater degree, but the system was becoming more broken. People were feeling more disenfranchised. There was more disinformation. There was more polarization as a consequence of 4 years of Biden, just as there was after 4 years of Trump the first time around. I do think that Trump is an accelerant in a way that perhaps Biden was not, but there's no president in recent memory that has actively been involved in trying to address these root causes. So in that regard, I think that we expect this political revolution at some point to continue. You're kicking the can down the road.
Ian Bremmer, I appreciate the list. I appreciate the conversation. Thanks so much for joining me. Until next time.
Always good to talk to you. Be good.